Is there also a strategy at play to provoke Russia into striking a NATO country, like the Baltics, in order to validate the narrative that Russia is the aggressor? And if so, is Moscow's focus on keeping the war contained to Ukraine a way of preventing exactly that escalation, especially as NATO's salami-slicing approach seems to test how far it can go without triggering a direct response?
Well, Counter-Ganoff is important because there are people in Russia that are very sympathetic to his point of view. So we can't dismiss it out of hand. But what we can say is that he is not in charge. And that whatever his views are, they are not necessarily shared by Mr. Putin or Mr. Lavrov or others. The Russians have lots of reasons, justifiable reasons to be angry. You know, that's clear. That's not open for debate. I certainly am sympathetic to their views. But cooler minds have prevailed. Now, here are a couple of questions that have to be answered. What's NATO? Now, President Trump just sent 5,000 troops to Poland. Everybody in the United States is sort of saying, what? What are you doing?
Just 3 weeks after announcing a drawdown of 5,000 troops from Germany, the decision appears to have been reversed or diluted, raising questions about whether this is real policy change or just reshuffling on paper. And with Congress also pushing legislation that limits the president's ability to withdraw forces unilaterally, it's unclear how much actual control the White House has over troop movements. Are we seeing a strategic shift, or just institutional constraints masking the same underlying policy?
Yeah, I think we're all trying to figure out what's going on, but I think there are a couple of things we can say with absolute certainty. There is no appetite inside the United States to fight a war anywhere. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if you tell the American people, well, I've thought a lot about it, obviously we need to go to war with Russia, people are going to look at you and say, you've lost your mind. You can't mobilize the United States for total war. The American people aren't going to accept it. They're not going to accept it against Iran. This is the fundamental concrete problem in American foreign and defense policy. Americans historically, and you know this, Pascal, from your experience inside the United States and North America, 90% of the American population on any given day could care less what happens beyond the borders of America. They just don't care. If you and I were to travel to Washington State and go to Seattle, Washington, or stop off in Kansas City or New Orleans in Louisiana and say, well, what do you think about NATO? I wager that more than half people say, what are you talking about? NATO, what is it? They don't even know. Secondly, you say, well, those Russians are bad. Oh, yeah, they may be bad. What are you bringing that up for? Well, we're going to go to war. What? Well, Russians may be bad, but that doesn't mean we want to go to war with them. What I'm trying to say is that the average American may not be as well-informed and well-educated as his European counterpart, but he is certainly more rational than the people in Washington. The people in Washington have operated in a vacuum for 30 years. They've been allowed to move forces wherever they wanted, to engage anybody they didn't like, to attack anyone that they chose to attack, provided it never affected anybody at home. And they've gotten away with it. Not just for the last 30 years, I would argue they've gotten away with it certainly since Vietnam. And the problem happened in Vietnam was very clear. We were broke by the time the war ended. That's why we came off the gold standard. So Johnson didn't bother trying to run for re-election. He knew he had no chance of winning. But we had a serious economic problem, a financial problem inside the United States. It could not be ignored. So what do? We left. We packed up and we left Vietnam. Did we ever go public and say, gee, we're so sorry, we killed almost 2 million Vietnamese and it was a dumb thing to do? Not really. Did we talk about what we did over there? Not very much. Not for many, many years. In fact, Vietnam just sort of vanished from the airways because that's the way we do things. We lost and it vanished. By the way, we lost in Korea. You know, we couldn't drive the Chinese out of off the Korean peninsula. And Eisenhower, who was surprised by the war and probably agreed with MacArthur, because before the war began, MacArthur, right after World War II, said we should get all the troops off the peninsula. It's indefensible. We can't defend it. It's not part of our security perimeter. Our security perimeter begins at the shores of Japan. But the State Department said, no, General, we're going to stay in Korea. So we stayed in Korea. We got a war. my point is that we're reaching a similar point now. We've lost. We've lost everywhere. We've lost in Iraq. We've lost in Afghanistan. But nobody cared because it didn't seem to have an effect. Now there's an effect. If you go back into April, and that's very, very recent, it's much worse now. But in April, we jumped from about 3.4 to 3.8% inflation. Actually, it was about 3.2 up to 3.8%. Projections now into the summer say we're going to go up to 6% inflation. Now, why does this matter? Because if you're going to go to 6% inflation or 5% inflation, what do you have to do with your interest rates to suppress inflation? You've got to raise them. Well, that means raising your interest rates if it's 5% to 6%, or raising your interest rates from where they are now to 7% if you're dealing with 6% inflation. What happens if we do that? Our financial system will collapse. Our economy will implode. We can't do it. So what is the right way to put this? What is the 500-pound gorilla in the room? It's not Russia. It's not China. It's not Iran. It's our own economy that is being grossly mismanaged, our reckless spending. And who's being held accountable for it? No one. But is someone going to be held accountable for it when it all comes apart? Yes. His name is Donald Trump. And also to move beyond that, the Koreans would very much like us to get off the Korean Peninsula so they can take charge of their country. They have this thing called operational control. We, the United States 4-star on the Korean Peninsula, commands all forces on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah.
Koreans don't want that. They want to command their own forces. I agree with them. I said that in 1997, which is one of the reasons Koreans brought me to Korea. But the point I'm trying to make is we need to get out of all of these places. That world is over. That world has changed.
How widespread is this sentiment inside the United States? It seems increasingly visible in conservative circles, with figures like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens questioning the logic of maintaining global military bases, while the issue is largely absent from much of the left. At the same time, even some neocon voices like Robert Kagan now acknowledge setbacks in places like Iran, though still argue for doubling down rather than scaling back. Is the U.S. moving toward a real rethinking of its global base network, or is this still a minority view that won't translate into policy?
Well, when we say inevitable, I suppose you can say that. I think you're probably right. The problem is that it doesn't matter which party you're talking about. Both parties have benefited enormously over many, many decades from the reckless spending. In other words, you can't expect the people that put you into the vulnerable position you are in right now to fix it. I mean, it's like talking to a room full of drug addicts and saying, we'd like you to help us break addiction for all these people that we find all over the United States. And since you're addicts, we know you'll help us. Well, that's impossible. The addict is not going to help other people get off the problem. We cannot expect this government to fix itself. So I think the government will simply fail. And I think that's where we're headed. It's going to implode. And this is very hard for people anywhere in the world to understand because whether you're a European, I just was on the phone this morning talking to someone who's in a conference in Belgrade. And what did they say? Oh, well, the United States is this invincible, impregnable force. You know, well, where's the evidence that anything is going to change? Well, people said that just before the Soviet Union collapsed. I remember it vividly. I had just come out of graduate school. I just published my PhD and in Cambridge University Press. And I was on the phone to a friend in England. And he said, you know, Doug, I think things are going to fall apart. I said, well, I do too. I just don't know when. And that's what I wrote my dissertation. Inevitably, it's going to fall apart. But he said, I think it's coming. Well, sure enough, and this is within a month or two, suddenly the East Germans are piling onto trains and driving all over East Germany, trying to find their way into West Germany. Suddenly the wall in Berlin comes down, just bang, 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 one after the other. I think that's what's going to happen with us. I think suddenly somebody's going to say, wait a minute, we can't go on like this. We have to make adjustments immediately. It will all be done badly. It'll be a replay, in my judgment, of something you saw in Afghanistan. When we came out of Afghanistan, Everyone had resisted in Washington leaving Afghanistan. Suddenly, the president said, that's it, we're getting out. And this haphazard withdrawal made fools of us, made us look incompetent, made the military look just terrible. Well, I think we're going to see something like that happen again because the emergency at home will outweigh the importance of anything overseas.
What would a scenario of American internal rejuvenation actually look like? Some argue, like former Ambassador Jack Matlock, that the Cold War effectively ended through negotiated agreements before the Soviet collapse, which itself came later due to separate internal pressures. But unlike the Soviet Union, a breakdown or restructuring of the United States is often seen as unthinkable given its federal structure. What kind of internal political or institutional changes would even be required for the U.S. to undergo meaningful renewal rather than gradual decline?
But let's back up, and Ambassador Matlock, whom I esteem and like very much, is talking about something very different. He's talking about the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Eastern Europe.
Yes.
We weren't negotiating the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We were negotiating the withdrawal of those forces. Very different proposition. And Gorbachev was smart. Today in Russia, everybody criticizes him and says he gave up too much too fast and so forth. That's all misleading. The situation inside the Soviet Union was already very fragile. He withdrew those forces, and he knew how to do that, and he did it very well. Just compare the withdrawal of the largest contingent of the Soviet forces in Eastern Europe from East Germany and compare that with our withdrawal from Afghanistan. Their withdrawal was infinitely better. And Russia did not look as though it was falling apart. It did fall apart later on for reasons that had nothing to do with the withdrawal from Eastern Europe and everything to do with internal contradictions. I'm saying our internal contradictions are going to drive us out. And whoever is in power, it may well be Donald Trump, and if he hesitates or refuses to act, he'll be replaced and someone else will come in and do it. But we too will withdraw from the rest of the world because we can't afford to stay there anymore, because we will not be able to pay out to the public at home all the money we owe everyone. We have all of these unfunded liabilities. We're having trouble with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. There are 2,000 redistribution programs designed as public welfare. All of these things are unaffordable. No one wants to step up and to do anything about it. It's unpopular. All of this is going to have to change. What's the easiest thing to cut? Defense spending. That's the easiest one. It's the largest portion of discretionary spending. It's the easiest to cut. And everyone will resist it, especially the senior ranks in the military, because that means they lose jobs. We have headquarters all over the place. We have 43, 44 4-stars. It's absurd. You know, at the height of World War II, we had 7. Towards the end of the war, we promoted others to 4-stars as honorifics. Gave them thank you, you did a great job, well done. We promoted people to 5-stars. It was an honorific, it was the same thing. But my point is, we're so top-heavy, it's pathetic. When you look at the small numbers of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines we can actually deploy to fight someplace and compare that to the numbers of admirals and generals, it's outrageous. So that's going to have to change. And cutting these headquarters, pulling the forces out of overseas billets, that's easy. You're not cutting forces inside the United States. If you go to upstate New York and say, well, this post we don't need anymore, there are 20,000 troops there, we're pulling them out, everyone will cry bloody murder. Oh, you can't do that. We have businesses here dependent on the post. And, you know, we have a manufacturer up here who produces things for the troops on the post. You're not going to withdraw forces from America. You're withdrawing forces from overseas. And that's something we can do with minimal pain here. It's going to happen.
Do you think this also extends to what's happening in the Caribbean? Or is the U.S. still aiming to act as a hemispheric hegemon there, including places like Cuba, Venezuela, and Puerto Rico? Or do you see the strategy shifting toward a more limited regional footprint, with less direct focus on the hemisphere as a whole?
I would tell you that we have been a hemispheric hegemon since 1846.
Yeah.
We became the hemispheric hegemon since we defeated Mexico. And in fact, that was something that the leaders of Mexico said: if we lose this war, we're going to be taking scraps off the plates of America forever. They were right. So we're already the hegemon. We don't have to prove that to anybody. We don't have to invade anybody to do that. This is the problem with Donald Trump. He's looking at Cuba, and I think in his mind, he wants to posture as liberating Cuba. Cuba's falling apart. That's fine. We should be interested, along with others in Latin America, in helping to manage that. Because what we don't want, and other countries in Latin America do not want, are hundreds of thousands of Cubans showing up on their doorstep. So that makes perfect sense. But to go into Cuba with U.S. forces, we did that 3 times in the first half of the 20th century. 3 times we invaded Cuba. We started in 1899, and then we went back shortly before World War I and after World War I. We wrote the Constitution. We supervised elections. We installed governments. And then we left. The place we stayed in, where we should have also gotten out, is Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is a bottomless pit for American tax dollars and resources. It's unproductive. It's not America. It's part of Latin America. We had no business being there. Our position there is untenable. We should get out. We would like to, but now people in Puerto Rico say, well, if you leave, we'll all be poor, because we're transferring billions of dollars to Puerto Rico on a routine basis. Cuba is a bottomless pit. We need to stay out of it. The people that are there are going to have to live there and govern themselves, however they decide to do that. We have to get accustomed to understanding 2 things. First of all, the whole world doesn't want to be a replica of the United States. That's nonsense. Secondly, there are many ways to govern besides the way we do it. And thirdly, different people with different cultures and different histories and different geography will do things differently from us. That doesn't mean they're a threat. So what we have to do with Cuba, I would argue, is help them in whatever way we can to manage this change that's going to happen down there. But we should stay out of it and absolutely not go into it.
Where do you think this is coming from? The fact that a significant part of the establishment in the US and even in Europe still seems unable to think outside the framework that others must become like us or they are a threat. What is driving that underlying sense of insecurity?
I think most of it can be traced to, the imperial past. First of all, we are very much like Great Britain. People need to understand, like Great Britain, we are not a continental land power. Now, we are in the Western Hemisphere, a continental power, and we can certainly field large armies if we want to. But historically, we don't do that. We are primarily a maritime and an aerospace power. In other words, we sail in, we fly in. And then when it's over, we sail home and we fly home. That's the problem right now in the Persian Gulf. We picked this country, Iran, to attack at the behest of Israel and Israel's agents in the United States, who insisted that if we do not destroy Iran, if we can't decapitate it, if we cannot change the regime, we have to destroy it because it's vital and essential to Israel's survival. So Donald Trump has believed that. He's taken that on, and he's decided to do what he can to destroy Iran. He makes all these comments about ending a civilization in the night. Yesterday, he talked about blowing up Oman. I mean, this is ridiculous nonsense. It has no place. It shouldn't be doing it, but this is what he said. But there's a problem. You cannot conquer Iran. Why not? Well, it's surrounded on 3 sides by some of the highest mountains in the world. It's not exactly terrain favorable to armies. To the south, you have virtually impassable deserts. It's about 140 degrees Fahrenheit down in southern Iran right now. That's not very helpful. In other words, the Iranians know they can take a lot of punishment and they can outlast us. And by the way, for a fraction of the money that we have spent on these World War II style forces, what have they done? They've invested very wisely in all of this missile and unmanned technology. They have access to satellites, thanks to the Chinese and the Russians, which gives them instantaneous targeting data. So they can hit any target within, say, 500, 600, 700 miles of their border. That's why the U.S. Navy is sitting 300 miles south of the Persian Gulf. It's not an accident. They don't particularly care to lose their ships. But what does this tell us? It tells us that warfare has changed. The old instrumentalities don't work anymore, but the old instrumentalities are also legacies of that imperial past. And we are a replica in a new way of the old British Empire. And of course, the French and the Dutch and the Belgians, and to a lesser extent, the Spaniards and the Portuguese, they've all been in the imperial business. They've all been in the colonial business. So whenever we go somewhere to fight somebody or deal with somebody, we're turning around to our European allies. But who are the allies that show up? Well, the old colonial powers. They saddle up and they show up with us because that helps them in their minds be relevant. But it's not relevant. It's stupid. It doesn't make any sense. Now, who doesn't fit the paradigm in Europe? Germany. Germany was historically not a colonial power. Germany was always interested in Germany. That was Bismarck's genius, that he said, look, we don't care to have an empire. We don't want colonies. We don't need a big navy. Obviously, they didn't take his advice, and that helped upset the relationship with Great Britain and brought on the First World War. But he was correct. And that is still the view inside Germany. You know, people are always talking about Hitler wanted to conquer the world. Hitler was furious with the Italians because he said, stay home. Don't go anywhere. We don't want to fight anywhere else. We're focused here in Europe. This is not new, but this is something we don't understand. So it's not surprising at all that you would see the Germans stand up and say, no, we don't want to be part of the enterprise in Iraq. We really don't want to be in Afghanistan. The Germans established a very small post in Afghanistan, and everybody loved it because they brought in excellent beer on a nearly a weekly basis, but they very rarely ever left their post. And why should they? They didn't really want to be there, but they were obligated under NATO. You know, I've got to go down there. I've got to put up with this nonsense. I don't think most Europeans today are very different from the Germans. Most Europeans are not interested in going all over the world unless it's as a tourist. You know, we are Americans. We're not interested in going anywhere unless we're tourists.
And now it appears the U.S., including the Trump administration and what some would call the more hawkish elements, is once again relying on intimidation, pressuring populations and leaderships into accepting future terms on Washington's conditions. Historically, sanctions have played a similar role, just through economic rather than military pressure. But this time, they seem increasingly strained. How effective is it really to sanction something like a Persian Gulf Strait authority that is essentially tied to Iran's own system? And what does it say about the limits of this strategy if even these tools are being pushed to their edge?
Isn't the sanctioning of Iran, it's the secondary sanctions that follow. For instance, any country or ship or whatever that goes through and pays the toll will be subject to secondary sanctions. So that's the goal, is to get people to say no. Except, gosh, Scott, you haven't really thought this one out, have you? Because if they say no, then the oil doesn't flow, and then they die.
Then they stay in the Strait of Hormuz.
Or be sanctioned by America. I think they're going to choose sanctions, Mr. Besant, because your sanctions suck. First of all, my understanding is that they're no longer paying in dollars, and the dollars are no longer going to the banks in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. That's the way Iran used to work until the United States went in and seized those assets, about $12 billion worth. Congratulations, America. You got $12 billion of stolen money that you're going to have to return eventually. It always works out that way. So now you're paying in yuan, Chinese currency, going into banks the United States doesn't control. Or I think that one of the things I've heard is cryptocurrency, that they're collecting tolls in cryptocurrency. Again, the U.S. has zero control over that. And so we can't stop Oman and Iran from doing this. And we can't stop the countries from paying it because they have to pay it to survive. You know, we can threaten secondary sanctions, but all that does is make people pull further away from the American orbit. I mean, you know, Marco Rubio, who I despise openly, once said the few honest things he said when he was talking about Brazil. And Brazil was talking about de-dollarization and you know, working with BRICS to come up with alternative means. And he said, we can't allow this to happen. If Brazil no longer pays in the dollar, we can no longer sanction them. And if we can't sanction them, we can't control them. And that changes most honest thing anybody's ever said. Because the whole concept of the dollar and everything isn't about, you know, the smooth economic flow. It's about American control, American ability to squeeze, your throat through sanctions. The world is waking up to the fact that there is a limit to American economic power. Russia proved it. China's proved it. Look, the Chinese were threatening. You can't buy. Scott Bessent again. He should learn to shut up. China, your private oil refineries, no Russian oil is allowed to go in there. If they go in there, we're going to sanction you. The Chinese government went, yeah, disregard. Do the Russian oil. If you sanction us, we'll crush you. And Trump already knows. Last time he tried to over-sanction China, China crushed him, squeezed him to death, made him surrender. This is the reality of it. This is a humiliating moment for the United States because one of the greatest economic weapons that we've had, which we've abused over the course of several decades, is now being exposed as literally an empty threat. Scott Bessent isn't going to sanction anybody. You think Iran is afraid of sanctions? Not at all. They've survived under stringent sanctions. And Iran owns us right now because I can guarantee you, if given the choice of being hit with secondary American sanctions or paying the tariff, people are paying the tariff because they need that oil more than they need the blessing of Scott Bessent.
Scott, I want to shift to the Ukraine front. In the last week, Russia has carried out strikes in response to what it described as a major attack in Lugansk that killed civilians, including students and university staff. Now we're seeing contradictory signals. Warnings for foreign embassy personnel to leave Kiev, reports of partial diplomatic withdrawals, and at the same time claims from Europe that it is standing firm, while the US position remains less clear. Meanwhile, there are indications that Ukraine and its backers may be escalating pressure further, even at the risk of civilian harm. So how do you assess what is happening on this front right now, and how might it connect to the broader strain the United States is facing in projecting power simultaneously in Ukraine and in the Iran context?
The reality is the United States we can't fight a sustained fight against Iran, which means we can't fight a sustained fight against China, and we can't fight a sustained fight against Russia. And we're not in a position to support others because we're out of ammunition. We're literally out of ammunition. We got nothing left. So we've taken America off the board in terms of relevance. We can't even threaten anything. We can't even get our act together on troops in Poland. 4,200 aren't rotating in, but 5,000 are going in, but Congress hasn't approved, so 5,000 aren't. We don't have anything. We're literally a bunch of hot air coming out of the mouths of the most irrelevant people in the planet. Unfortunately, there are some relevant people that are doing relevant things. The British are very relevant. The British have been running a very successful campaign, which sought to divert the focus of effort away from the battlefield reality where, contrary to popular belief in the West, Russia is dominating across the battlefield. Things are not going well for the Ukrainians and haven't been for some time now. But the British have been playing a different game, a mental warfare game, designed to collapse Russia from within. Anybody who thinks that that's not possible, take a look at the collapse of the Soviet Union. You'll understand how mental warfare played a role in getting Russians to stop believing in themselves, Russians to start looking to the West as a dominant society, to lose faith in your leadership, to lose faith in everything, to abandon what you're supposed to be, who you are. That's what happened in the decade of 1990s. Vladimir Putin did a reversal and built Russia up to where it is today, where they're proud of themselves with just reason, and all this stuff. We're trying to break that down again. That's what mental war is. And one of the things we're doing is exploiting the fact that Vladimir Putin doesn't want to escalate, that Vladimir Putin wants to keep this war confined to Ukraine and deal with the limited objectives of making sure Ukraine doesn't join NATO and doesn't retain Banderist Nazi ideologies, things of that nature, doesn't pose a threat to Russia. So the West has been testing him all along. Every time a red line is drawn, F-16s, red line, Third World War, F-16s come in, Russia just responds by killing the F-16s. HIMARS, attack them, shooting them down, nullify them. How many times? When's the last time you heard about ATACMS doing anything worthwhile in Ukraine? You don't. It's the same thing. Every escalation is managed by Russia. Operation Spiderweb, drones coming in hitting bombers. That should have triggered a massive response. Russia just blew it off because they said it doesn't change the fundamental direction we're heading. We're doing okay. But the British have been focusing on asymmetric warfare, hybrid warfare, using drones. Everybody talking about Ukrainian drone operations. At the tactical level, the Ukrainians, I think a lot of the innovation is theirs. But when you get up to the strategic level, this is 100% a British-driven operation assisted by the CIA and in Germany. Firepoint, a Ukrainian drone production company, is look at the CEO. She's some girl with no education who's just a bimbo who was given the job to serve as a way to steal money to enrich Zelensky. But the British took it over and made it something real. The FP5 Flamingo is a British-made weapon. A British-made weapon. It's fired against the Russian strategic depth, claiming to be Ukrainian. Before this war started, the Russians made a point to Joe Biden. We will not tolerate NATO missiles based in Ukraine that can hit Russia's strategic depth. Now you have NATO missiles based in Ukraine that hit Russia's strategic depth, a red line that was crossed. But the Russians went, we can ride this thing out. We can do this. The same thing with the FP1s, this wooden, drone that flies in and hits oil rigs and all that. The Russians are blowing it off, saying it's not a big deal. But there's a continuing echo chamber going out there shouting out about how weak Putin is, how, impotent Russia is, how this, that, and the other thing. And it's starting to resonate within certain segments of Russian society. And you start to get defeatism. You got people start doubting Vladimir Putin. Now, it hasn't reached critical mass. It's a long way from doing that, but it's there. This latest attack against Starobelsk Teachers College is the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't know if Ukraine and Great Britain intended it to be this way. I don't even know if they hit us, if they knew up front they were hitting a teacher's college. I actually think that AI assisted in the designation of the target, just like we did with Manab, clearly a school for children, but we bombed it thinking it was the headquarters of a missile brigade. Here they thought, because they saw photographs of students from another college, not this one, wearing military uniform, that this was a military facility. It's not. Those students were students who were participating in a game. They're non-combatants, not affiliated with the military, everything. That's the reality of it. But the AI doesn't see that because AI is not intelligent. AI just does what the people programmed to do. They saw a photograph and said, this school is a military target. And then the attack was sent in. FP1 drones, 4 of them, each one outfitted with air-to-ground rockets. That's the new variation, which means that somebody has to see it because you don't fire air-to-ground rockets in the blind. This isn't a situation where you program in a GPS coordinate and the FP1 flies out there and flies in and dives in where it tells the dove. There's another drone above this. There's Starlink connectivity, we know, because they got the antennas, and it's being broadcast back to a command center. And that command center is seeing the target. So these drones come in and they cycle off their air-to-ground rockets. The eyewitnesses on the ground say, we heard rocket fire. We could see the rockets come in. We could hear the rockets come in. FP1 is a propeller-driven thing. It's not a rocket. So rockets being fired. Cycle back, fire again. Cycle back, fire again. 4 times. Then they dive in at the end because they carry 200-kilogram bombs. Dive in, boom, 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 collapse the building, kill 21 students. This resonated in Russia unlike anything. I mean, even in Kursk, when in August of 2024, when the British and American-led Nazis, literal Nazis, I mean, when I say Nazi, I mean swastika-wearing Nazis, went into Kursk, and the Russians couldn't evacuate the elderly from the border villages quick enough. And so hundreds of them, 600 or so, were captured. They were all murdered, butchered, raped. These Nazis were raping 80-year-old women, filming it. And then they go off and they get killed, and the Russians get the bodies, they get the cameras, and they have it. This is not speculation. This is statements of fact, and that didn't trigger this Russian reaction. The Russians still went, we'll just kill them, kill 60 to 80,000 of them, recapture the territory, and keep moving. We're not going to escalate. This attack is different. It hit Russia at the wrong time, and it basically has created an outrage that cannot be ignored by the Russian government. So what the Russian government did, first of all, is respond with a massive strike designed to take out the units responsible. Remember when I said that Starlink was involved? The problem with Starlink involved is that that signal that's going back to have some guy watch this gets intercepted. And the Russians knew where it was. It was probably being run out of, there's a facility south of Kiev where the Oreshnik hit, White Church, it was called, Bely Sirkov. Hit these above ground garages, but we know that those disguise, or those were aircraft maintenance disguised in compartment built during Soviet times, expanded by the Ukrainians, where the FP-1 drone unit was that was directing this fight. The Russians took it off the map. It's gone, finished. They struck other facilities in and around Kiev. It's funny how people are like, they struck a museum. They struck a museum. They struck a shopping center. They struck civilian targets. Except, gosh, it's the Ukrainians that sit there and make the videos that say, the FP-1 drone, a great weapon. We're hitting the Russian oil thing, but we don't produce it in a factory, because if we produce it in a factory, the Russians would hit the factory and destroy it. So today we're in a school gymnasium. Today we're in the basement of a museum. Today they sort of openly admit it. Every place the Russian hit were FP-1 drone production facilities related to the attack on this school, command and control facilities, etc. That's what that attack was. That's all it was. Everybody thought that was going to be the big attack that does it. No. Then the Russians came out and said, because, again, Putin doesn't do anything in, knee-jerk. Standard response, and then he sits there and he waits, he deliberates, and they come out and they say, that's it, we're done. No more negotiations. Negotiations are finished. So anybody call us and everybody else in Europe going, well, we're going to try and figure out who's going to represent us in the negotiations with the Russians. There is no more negotiations. This will be unconditional surrender. That's it. Ukraine will accept Russia's terms as dictated by Russia without modifications, or Ukraine will die. That's where we're at. Now, they sent out, in accordance with international law, they have to give adequate warning of any attack that may, cause casualties among the civilian population. And so that's what Russia did. They did it in writing. They've done it with phone calls. And everybody's sitting there going, well, why didn't they have attacked yet? Well, because the Russians are smarter than you and me. I myself said I thought that Kiev would be erased. They're not going to erase Kiev. Why? Because the Russians are smarter than you and me. A member of the State Duma, part of the Defense Committee, gave an interesting interview yesterday where he said, because I'm like, take out the Rada, take out the parliament, make it a visually pleasing thing. He said, yeah, the parliament's empty. And you want me to put an Oreshnik on the parliament? An Oreshnik costs $50 million. You want to put a $50 million weapon on an empty building that doesn't accomplish anything. No, when you use the Oreshnik, people have to die. Important people have to die. You have to collapse structures that are underground. That's what the Oreshnik does. So when they fire the Oreshnik, it's at a target that is designed to be collapsed and kill the people inside. That means you have to collect the intelligence where that target is. So they're not going to strike until they get the intelligence. The other thing they said is that this is going to take place over time. So it doesn't have to happen all at once. Fact is, if you go back in the intelligence business, sort of what I used to do in the when I was a weapons inspector, you call it shake the tree. But basically, you go in, you do something to provoke, and then in this case, I move in on a Special Republican Guard facility adjacent to a presidential palace because I believe the Special Republican Guard is hiding weapons of mass destruction documents. I can't prove it though, so I go in there and I jolt them. Then I see what happens. Do cars go out the back? Where do the cars go? This worked like a champ. One place we hit, and sure enough, the cars went out. We tracked it to a place downtown Baghdad, had the U2 image take a picture of it. I went there, and it was an evacuation point for documents related to the work that the Iraqis didn't want us to know about. Shake the tree, make them act, go, and you pounce on them. But in this case, it's not going to be inspections that pounce. It's going to be Oreshnik. It's going to be, Iskander. It's going to be precision munitions. They're going to hit the important things. Decision-making centers, and, command and control and defense industry production, because the Ukrainians are not going to put it all in the factory. The factories are going to disappear. They're going to break it up and hide it around the country as they are wont to do. And Russians will detect it and kill it. This is a long-term strategy of absolutely degrading Ukraine's ability to stay in this fight. And that's what we're going to see going forward. I don't think we're going to see the massive strike that everybody's expecting. I was expecting it, but I don't think we're going to see that because I've been listening. That's the sign of a good analyst, by the way. You shut up sometimes. We're on a talk show, so I'm talking. But when we're done, I shut up and I listen. I listen to what the Russians say. I read what the Russians write, and I absorb it. And in absorbing what the Russians have been saying, I don't think there's going to be a massive decapitation strike. I think there's going to be a program of precision strikes over time that destroy Ukraine's ability to continue this fight. And that there's nothing the West can do about it. The other thing is the Russians are prepared to strike Europe, and the decision has already been made. Latvia is on notice. If they allow, next week, there's the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And that's where I'm headed to speak. But the day after I speak, Vladimir Putin speaks. The Ukrainians want to put drones into the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. They're not going to. If they fly through the Baltic corridor, then the Baltic nations will be destroyed, eliminated. That's just a statement of fact. And if Europe wants to do anything about it, then Russia will hit them as well. This is where Russia's at right now. They're just tired of playing games. They're tired of, dealing with stupid people. And they're just at the point right now where if you continue to attack Russia in a way that threatens it existentially, Russia will respond accordingly. Ukraine, unfortunately, is going to find out this lesson. It's the end of Ukraine. Ukraine will cease to exist in the state that it is. There will be unconditional surrender. Russia will control the government. The United States no longer has a vote. You remember how Donald Trump was talking about how we're going to have, security guarantees. We're going to have, we're going to control this and that and the other thing. The U.S. doesn't have a vote. We're done. We actually backed out. We're finished. And they will never be invited back in. That's the reality. Europe's never been invited in, although they think they want to be invited in. Nobody will be invited in. This is between Russia and Ukraine.
Scott, I see a parallel here with what we've been hearing from the Trump administration, especially since the early phase of the Iran strikes, where officials repeatedly claimed that Iran's military capabilities had been essentially destroyed. At the same time, we're seeing a similar narrative around Russia, portraying it as being on the back foot, even as the reality on the ground appears far more complex and unresolved. Yet despite these claims of weakness on the other side, neither conflict seems to be producing a clear or decisive outcome for the U.S. or its allies. So how do you interpret this gap between the political messaging and the actual strategic results we're seeing in both cases?
Well, let's look at a statement of fact. Remember that you don't have to put that chart up, but the chart that you had there before, and they talked about a framework agreement. That's a framework agreement between the Trump administration and American defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and others, that they're going to ramp up production. There's no money been attached to that, so therefore it's purely theoretical. Nothing's happening. That's the state of U.S. defense industry, totally incapable of meeting the demands of modern war. As we saw, a 37-day campaign against Iran has literally drained the arsenal of the West. An ongoing conflict with Ukraine has done the same with Europe and what's ever left of the United States arsenal. Zero. Russia, on the other hand, has been building up its defense industry. It's just chugging along like you wouldn't believe. And Russia's not just building things and using things. That's how we operate in the West, by the way. That's one of the reasons why we don't have massive stockpiles, because you can't convince Congress of the need to overproduce and have 5,000 weapons sitting in a warehouse that may never get used. And if they never get used, then they get outdated. And that means we just spend a lot of money on weapons because our weapons are very expensive. So we can't overproduce them. We have to produce just the number we need to meet certain benchmarks of training and operational storage. But our operations are always based on short wars because we're going to intimidate the enemy into surrendering. We don't have any plan for long wars because we can't produce enough weapons to support a long war. Look at this 37-day war. We couldn't do it. Russia, on the other hand, operates only on the concept of long wars. So their defense industry is not just producing weapons for this war, but remember, their military went from 900,000, then was expanded to 1.2 million, and now is currently expanded, I think, to over 2 million. That's a lot of people. Where are they getting their weapons? From Russian defense industry. And it's not just guns and uniforms and ammunition. It's the weapons of war, tanks. I love when I hear stupid people like Jeff Fisher, some retired colonel idiot who's like, the Russians don't have anything. The Russians have everything, Jeff. Everything you don't have, everything the West doesn't have. They've been producing tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces on a regular basis, and they don't go to the front lines exclusively. They go out to equip the new units that have been created, like the 70,000 strong new Army Corps in the St. Petersburg military district that has armor, artillery, everything. And you don't just build armor, artillery, you have the ammunition that they need to fight a sustained war. So they build up the ammunition stocks as well. This is what Russia is doing. Russia will never run out of ammunition. Look at Oreshnik. Russia's fired 3 of them. The first 2 were experimental models. I don't know what this one was, probably a serial production one. They went into serial production in August. Let's just call August a wash, meaning we plan on going to serial production, but we haven't quite produced it yet. So September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May. 9 months. Minimum production, 5 Oreshniks. 9 times 5, 45. 45 minus 1, 44. They have 44 Oreshniks. But that's minimum production. Maximum production, based upon what I experienced when I worked at Vodkinsk, they could probably produce, they were running out the, annual production for the SS-20s, 80 a year or so. But let's just call it, let's break it down. Let's call it half that. The bottom line is that there's 60 or so. The Russians probably have somewhere, around, 50, 60, 70 Oreshniks. That's a lot. They're not all going to be used against Ukraine. There's Oreshniks that are set aside for, first of all, Belarus, which has its own regiment, 9 launchers. Each launcher probably a complement of 2. That's 18 missiles that can be armed and fired against Europe. There's other regiments out there. Germany's got its own Oreshniks attached to it. England does, France. The Oreshnik covers a whole bunch of stuff. They have long-range, Iskanders, thanks to the fact that we got out of the INF treaty. The Iskander K now probably operates in a range of over 2,000 kilometers. That can hit Europe as well, also hit Ukraine. But they've been producing these. They've been producing some prodigious number. When the war first started, the Russians, the Iskander was a Army-level battlefield support weapon. So in order to fire an Iskander, it had to go up the chain, and an Army-level commander had to say, we're going to hit that target. You understand that that is not a responsive targeting. That is a strategic targeting, command and control, command posts, airfields, in support of a larger operation. Today, Iskanders, on a daily basis, are literally on launch-ready mode with a forward observer with a drone. And he can sit out there, boom, and he gets a target that is deemed worth hitting, troops training something. He can direct the Iskander to be fired instantly, and it will hit the target. Why can they do that? Because they've produced so many Iskanders, they can now bring it down to be literally a battlefield support weapon. The Russians have nothing but ammunition. And they're, the British just, 500,000 Russian dead. No, probably 300,000. That's probably an accurate number. But the British can't tell the truth because they're involved in this psychological operation. Now, 300,000 is a lot. That sort of matches the numbers that we lost the United States in both theaters of World War II. So anybody pretending this isn't a bloody war is wrong. But the Ukrainian numbers are about 2.2 million right now, dead. When you add wounded, over 5 million. And the data seems to support this. Even Scott Blaber, Pete Blaber, former Delta Force guy in the know, has come out and talked about millions of Ukrainian dead. Because that's the truth. We can try to disguise it any way we want to. The Russians aren't losing 30,000 men a month. It's not even close to that. The Ukrainians are losing 1, 2, 3, 4,000 guys a day. And they can't recruit enough. There's a deficit there. This is the reality. The Russians are doing everything right. They're not doing it the way some in the West would like it to. There's a lot of people say, we want it to end, want it to do this, want it to do that. Russians are doing it their way. Frank Sinatra literally sang a song about them. They've done it their way. This is the reality. The Russians are winning this war. And now the Russians are going to win the mental war aspect too, because they're going to flip the script on the British, and it's going to be the collapse. When the Russians begin this campaign of taking down Ukrainian decision-making centers, they're going to make it lethal to be somebody working with the Ukrainians. Right now, underground, there's a whole bunch of NATO guys, a whole bunch of American guys in there working with the Ukrainians. It's going to become lethal to do this. They're not going to hit the embassy and kill American diplomats. But if Americans have any of their technicians underground in a center, they're going to die. And when that happens, the rats will leave the sinking ship and the Ukrainians will be on their own, and it'll eventually lead to the total collapse of Ukraine, which could happen as soon as this summer. June is going to be a critical month. I mean, that's why I'm excited. I didn't know about this when I decided I'm going to Russia in June, but I'm going to be in Russia in one of the most important months of this entire. This is the month of decision. I think the outcome's obvious, but still, it's going to be contested. Zelensky has announced that June's the month where he's going to launch the long-awaited drone offensive that was supposed to break the will of the Russian people. 16 to 20,000 drones are being provided by the British. Zelensky's talking about launching up to 6,000 drones a day against Russian targets. The Russians will counter. It's going to get ugly fast. It's all going to happen in June. I don't know if, they say St. Petersburg at night, you're supposed to go out at night. They raise the bridges. You look at the ships go through the stars. It's beautiful. I think we might get a different light show altogether, because this is the reality of war. But it's going to be a major month. And I think it's going to be the month that Ukraine stops functioning as a modern nation state and starts functioning as a nation in absolute collapse, absolute decline.
What is the current position of the United States on Ukraine, and how has it evolved in recent weeks amid shifting geopolitical dynamics?
U.S., Ukraine, are you familiar with the expression, the red-headed stepchild? So in sort of U.S. culture, there was, if a family adopted a kid, they call him the red-headed stepchild. He wasn't the favorite, he wasn't part of the inner family. It's always treated as an outsider. That's what Ukraine is now with respect to the United States, the red-headed stepchild, because the favorite son, Israel, they're getting all the love, all the money, all the weapons, and the Ukraine's getting nothing. And, what's really, there's also a lot of self-deceit between both the West and in Ukraine. Zelensky wrote this letter to Trump complaining about, we need more Patriot missiles, we need more air defense. Ukraine started getting their first batch of Patriot missiles, PAC-3s, in 2023. And so 2023, 2024, into early 2025, they received a grand total of like 950 PAC-3 missiles. Now, do the math. So if you've got an inbound Russian missile, ballistic, cruise, or even a Garand drone, you're going to have to fire 2 of those PAC-3s at that incoming missile. So just do a search on one of the AI engines and ask the question, how many missiles has Russia fired since 2023? And ballistic, cruise, I didn't even ask about drones. Numbers between 8,000 and 12,000. So do the math. If you got 950, that means you can shoot at 475 missiles. And if you do that, you've exhausted your supply of PAC-3s. And they're shooting down 90% of 12,000, 8,000 to 12,000 missiles. Please, stop lying. They don't. The point is, Ukraine has hardly had any air defense system now for more than 2 years. And, they always put a happy face on it, claiming, oh, yeah, we shot down X amount. They haven't. And the sad part of this is they can beg the United States all they want for more PAC-3 missiles. The United States produces an average of about 60 a month. Okay, which means they could take out 30, potentially take out 30 missiles. Well, where's the priority? The priority with Israel or with Ukraine?
Obviously, Israel is central here. But at the same time, Ukraine seems to have drawn a similar lesson to Iran, that you may not be able to prevent incoming strikes, but you can preserve your ability to respond. What's proving effective isn't expensive systems like Patriot, but rather low-cost drones that can still inflict damage, leaving both sides in a position where they're forced to absorb ongoing strikes. And often, it's the larger power that proves more vulnerable to that pressure.
No, I disagree, for this reason. One, most of the drones that are fired into Russia are shot down. Russia still they have a very ample and effective air defense system.
Right.
A few get through, and they cause some damage, but damage on what scale? Let's remember in size comparison, and even the size comparison with Iran. Ukraine is roughly 1/3 the size of Iran, okay, in terms of landmass. And when you look at all of the 8,000 to 12,000 ballistic and cruise missiles over a 4-year period, no telling how many, I'd say easily 20 to 30,000 drones. Even with all that firepower spread out over Ukraine, it still hasn't hollowed out the society. It is reducing it by attrition. Ukraine, for its part, they don't even come close to that kind of firepower. Their only real firepower now are they may have some storm shadows, and they've got some drones. Now they're getting a fairly significant resupply of drones from the UK, but then that makes the UK now a target based upon what Lavrov announced the other day. So it is from the Russian standpoint, they're pursuing a military plan. It doesn't fit within any of the Western models of how we think we should do warfare, even though the West has these plans. But look how poorly they performed over the last 66 years. We don't have to look at just one case. We got multiple cases. Let's go to the Korean War. U.S. failed to defeat North Korea and China in the Korean War, failed to defeat Vietnam, and then all these other scattershot wars. We quote defeated Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, even though looking back on it, that was a war that never should have happened because Saddam was a client of the United States. Iraq had been supported, funded, armed, equipped by the United States during its war with Iran. And then in a little over less than a year and a half, the United States turned with a vengeance on Saddam Hussein. You got to look back at that. That war was so unnecessary. And I looking back, I didn't realize back then what I understand today, what I know today. Because then I viewed that, I hadn't followed the history of the Iran-Iraq War. I didn't realize the United States had been supplying the chemical and biological weapons and providing the intelligence that Iraq was using to attack Iran. I just said, hey, here's this Saddam guy out of the blue attacks Kuwait. I didn't really understand that Saddam had met with the U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie and said, hey, these Kuwaitis are stealing our oil, so I'm going to go in and stop it. Do you have a problem with that? And April said to him, the U.S. has no position on that. And he said, okay. And remember, this is the guy who had been interacting with CIA and U.S. Department of Defense assets for almost 10 years. So, he thought, hey, Americans, I got a decent relationship with them. Little did he understand that he was still the redheaded stepchild. Favorite son Israel was still at the forefront and was one of the major justifications, or at least motivations, for the United States to do that attack in 1990 to drive him out of Kuwait. So this is, the United States militarily has failed. And that's the other thing, I think, the revelation for Russia out of this whole, it's one thing to do an intelligence assessment, but then it's another thing to see how it actually plays out on the battlefield. Scott Ritter and I had a brief disagreement in the summer of 2022 when they first introduced the United States first introduced some of its 155 millimeter artillery and one of the earlier short range missiles. And Scott said at the time he thought that was a game changer, and I said, no, it's not. This doesn't alter the course. But now we're at a stage of what we're going to see the Russians do will be a game changer. It will fundamentally change the nature of the war, and it's going to because now Russia realizes the United States is effectively a paper tiger. It can cause some damage. But the United States has been unable to defeat the Houthis, and now it's been unable to defeat Iran and all of its so-called Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons supplied to Ukraine, have failed to put a dent in Russia's military and industrial capability.
The key concern is the potential endgame from Russia's perspective. If we look at past statements, like Hillary Clinton suggesting Ukraine could become Russia's Afghanistan, the strategy seems clear. Turn the conflict into a prolonged quagmire. Not necessarily a war you win outright, but one where constant low-level pressure, insurgency, drones, small-scale strikes, gradually wears down the opponent over time. We're already seeing elements of that with persistent drone attacks into Russian territory, designed as cumulative pinpricks rather than decisive blows. So the real question is, how does Russia avoid being drawn into a long war of attrition that it may dominate militarily, but still struggle to decisively end?
Well, Russia actually has a successful track record in dealing with insurgencies, Western-backed insurgencies. The first one was in the aftermath of World War II, going into 1949, 1950. And the CIA and MI6 were busy with Banderites putting together Ukrainian units that were to carry out attacks in Russia. It took the Russians then about 6 years to quell that. Then let's jump ahead to the 1990s. You had the first Chechen War, 92, 93, but then the second one, that was begun in earnest in August, I think the date was August 9th of 1999, and that went on for about 11 years. It ended in 2010 when Medvedev was president. So Russia has successfully fought insurgencies, Western-backed insurgencies, and defeated them. And the defeat in the Second Chechen War was it a brutal war? Oh, absolutely. The Russians killed a lot of people. But when it was all over, they had the loyalty of the Muslim population in Chechnya. And I can testify to that just based on my conversations with General Abdialudinov. He's a hero of Russia, but he's a devout Muslim. And he was involved with those as a very young man, teenager, in that Second Chechen War. So Russia they're continuing this war of attrition, bleeding out Ukraine. But on top of it, I think, what we're going to see is Russia will take Kiev, however we want to pronounce it, and they will take Odessa and probably Transnistria. Before this is all over, they will militarily defeat Ukrainian forces. And if any NATO forces try to go in and defend in Odessa, they'll be wiped out. And it's going to be Russia. It'll be brutal, but that's where I see what Russia's prepared to do.
At this stage, Russia still appears intent on keeping the conflict contained within Ukraine. Ukraine, meanwhile, is pushing to broaden it, with Europe largely aligned and seeking to Europeanize the war. In the end, much may hinge on Washington's decision, whether to contain the conflict or allow it to expand further.
Yeah, Trump will not get further involved with Ukraine. I'm pretty confident of that. He's too caught in Iran. The United States we've already got very limited military operations there, and he's suffering a political beating right now. His popularity, it's at the same level as Richard Nixon in his second term. And remember, Nixon in his second term was in the midst of Watergate. 63% of Americans opposed him. And that's where Trump is right now. 63, he's only got 37% saying they support Trump.
The Iran war appears to have significantly damaged Trump's MAGA base, with little sign of recovery so far. And in that context, his recent claim that he spoke with multiple West Asian leaders, including Turkey, and that they should all join a peace framework essentially tied to the Abraham Accords and recognize Israel, including countries like Pakistan, raises serious questions. Historically, neutral or non-aligned states have never been pushed into joining peace agreements in this way. Is this a realistic diplomatic strategy, or a move that actually makes any meaningful agreement even less likely?
Yeah, well, apparently the reports are that when he brought that up, he had all these people on a conference call. And when he brought that up, there was dead silence. Nobody spoke up and said, yeah, Mr. President, that's a great idea. Yeah, well, let's do that. Or is something like the Abraham Accords possible? Yes, I think under one scenario. That scenario would be Israel must grant statehood to the Palestinians. They must be secure. Israel has withdrawn its military forces back to the appropriate boundaries. And then, and only then, would these other nations be willing to entertain recognizing Israel's as a sovereign state. As long as they continue to fight the wars and attack Lebanon and attack the Palestinians, there will be no Abraham agreement. And the Saudis made that very clear. The next day, they released a statement saying, no, not going to happen until the rights of the Palestinian people are addressed. Same thing out of Qatar and same thing out of Iran. So, you're right. It looks as if Trump's maybe trying to deliberately sabotage his own peace effort. But that's not going anywhere.
Or is he actually engaged in an internal struggle with figures like the neocons, including Lindsey Graham and Mike Pompeo, who immediately pushed back when a deal with Iran was reportedly close? And when Trump suddenly floats ideas like this, is it a way of placating that wing, or just reopening divisions inside his own camp?
Yeah, well, as you correctly note, the social media accounts with the Zionist crowd went wild.
Oh, yeah.
And that may have, and again, today we saw Trump said things that someone who is in touch with White House sources wrote and said, look, Trump has once again pulled the plug on a peace agreement by his, statements that, that Iran's not going to remain in control of the Strait of Hormuz, and that and insisting that the Abraham Accord must be upheld. So I know the Pakistanis, that they've got the lead role in this negotiations, trying to patch together an agreement. They've got the full backing of China, and China and Russia are both involved in diplomatic pressure on the Gulf Arabs. Now, if we're coming on air, I got a report from somebody who is involved with the negotiations from the Chinese side, and they report that Qatar has now informed the United States, basically, you got 6 to 9 months, get the hell out of Qatar, which means closing Al Udeid Air Force Base, which is the largest. It is the brain center for all U.S. military operations in West Asia. I'm actually surprised Iran didn't inflict more damage on it during the first 5 weeks of the war. And that may have been because, you remember, it's a complicated relationship between Iran and Qatar. A few years back, Qatar was isolated. It was facing attack from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And they were actually preventing, the arrival of even humanitarian supplies. Well, who supplied Qatar during that time? Iran. So the Qataris are not a bunch of ingrates. They remember that. And so this is why, in fact, Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, was in Qatar. And I don't know who he specifically met with, but I'm sure it was with the leaders. So Iran is this whole new security architecture. It is they're working to put that together. And what that means is the exclusion of the United States from West Asia.
And it seems that Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar have already pushed back against U.S. positioning, while even Oman, despite its limited strategic profile, has still been pulled into the wider spillover dynamics. There are also claims that fragmented command structures on the ground may have contributed to unintended strikes across the region. Is a broader message now taking hold in the Gulf that U.S. presence itself is part of the instability? And is that shifting the direction of negotiations on the ground?
It's not an overnight process, and there's still the Pakistanis are working at the direction of the Chinese. Want to ensure that they get this new security architecture in place, that basically it will be the Gulf states and Iran guaranteeing their own security as a group.
Yeah.
And so the one problem child in this whole mashup is United Arab Emirates. Yeah. And even within the Emiratis, it's not all of the emirs. It's basically the guy MBZ, who I believe is in what is the other? It's not Dubai. The other main city in
Abu Dhabi.
UAE, Abu Dhabi. Yeah, I think that's his main, where he hangs his hat. So this is a work in progress. But as we came on air, I see that there were new clashes tonight over Bandar Abbas. So this may still get back into a heated exchange. It looks like Foreign Minister Arachi traveled to Moscow yesterday. Kremlin hasn't highlighted. I'm assuming it was Arachi. It may have been the Minister of Defense. The Russians so far haven't issued any readout on that kind of meeting. So, and I'm sure it's negotiations and talks about what could Iran be suggesting. Iran said, okay, look, we'll give up the enriched uranium provided that Russia store it. There was also talk that Pakistan would store it. And then Trump was saying, no, that couldn't happen. But, for Iran, it's a red line. The United States is not going to tell Iran what it can do with its enriched uranium. Iran will make that decision.